But thank you for joining this webinar between Seleke and Gibbons and CBRE this morning. We'll be very delighted to talk to you all this morning about investing in Cambodia. There are some really interesting trends going on here at the moment, and some of you might be intrigued by the title, "Why is now the time?" I think we'll try and get to the answer of that as we go along this morning. But very pleased to be doing this alongside Jay Cohen. Jay's been here for about 12 years now and has been leading Seleke and Gibbons for the last 2 years, and has got a great deal of experience in the legal side of investing in Cambodia. So delighted to welcome him to speak with us.
Again, James, thank you for that introduction. Today we're going to be talking about investing in Cambodia and the legal aspects of real estate investments. Okay, so for today's agenda, we're going to be talking about 7 different topics related to real estate. First, we're going to start with the legal framework for real estate. So by the end of this talk, you're going to know all the basic rules for owning land, for owning co-owned buildings, and also the basic rules for real estate developers. Then we're going to talk about structuring real estate investments in Cambodia. So obviously that's a key issue if you're looking at acquiring land or you're looking at developing real estate to do that. Then we're going to be moving on to investment incentives for real estate investments. So Cambodia has a very attractive package of incentives for investors. So we're going to look at some of those. Then we're going to be talking about licensing for real estate developers and construction permits. So we're going to be looking at, again, what sort of licenses and construction permits people require. Then we're going to be looking at tax issues. So I think anytime you do an investment, you're probably interested in what are the tax implications of your investment. And then lastly, we're going to talk about due diligence in real estate. So if you're looking at acquiring real estate, I think it's really important to be aware of what you need to take a look at, whether you're a developer looking at buying a plot for development, whether you're like a private investor looking at acquiring like a home or a condo. It's just good to understand what are the key points that you should be looking for. Okay, so the first part will be the legal framework for real estate. Before we get to the legal framework, we're going to take a moment to just talk about some of the good things about investing in Cambodia. Cambodia has a very pro-business investment framework. And that's really, I think, one of the great things about investing in Cambodia. So if you look at why is that the case? One, you have investment incentives available, and that's something we'll talk about a little bit later. There's no requirements for joint ventures. So typically foreigners can own 100% of companies, except for land. So that's one point we need to keep in mind, and we'll talk about that today. There's no thin capitalization rules, meaning you can incorporate a company for $1,000 or $5,000. You don't necessarily have to invest significant capital to get started. There's no nationality or residency requirements for directors, which makes it very easy for foreign investors to come in and control real estate or companies. Also, there's no currency controls. People are allowed to freely bring money into Cambodia and take money out of Cambodia. So that's something that's quite positive. Also, there's very few restrictions on foreigners participating in any business sectors. So it's a really positive business environment. And this positive business environment certainly supports investment in the real estate sector. So the basic land ownership rules in Cambodia are quite simple. And the basic rule is only Cambodian citizens and companies of Cambodian nationality can own land. And to be a company of Cambodian nationality, the company must be incorporated in Cambodia, and at least 51% of the shareholders must be Cambodian citizens or other companies of Cambodian nationality. So that's really the basic rule. And it's important to keep that in mind because as we move forward today and we look at some of the structuring issues, we're going to be coming back to this basic rule about what is a company of Cambodian nationality. So we're going to keep that in mind. But then what happens if you don't want to buy land? What happens if you want to own some other kind of real estate, for example, like a condo or something in a co-owned building? So we're going to talk about co-owned buildings. And the first question is, what is a co-owned building? So I will say, for people that are familiar with condominiums, a co-owned building is similar to a condominium. I mean, it means that several co-owners live together. In that building, there are certain private units that are owned exclusively by each co-owner. At the same time, there are parts of the building, common areas, that are either owned by everybody or can be used by everybody. I want to highlight that to be a co-owned building, the building must specifically be registered as a co-owned building. So if you see just any apartment building, particularly you see buildings built before the early 2000s, most of those buildings, probably none of those buildings are actually structured as co-owned buildings. So to be structured as a co-owned building, there's a number of requirements, one of which you need a construction permit, you need to submit an application at the Ministry of Land Management, Urban Planning and Construction. And then additionally, there are specific management rules for that building that will govern the relationship between all of the co-owners. So there's a number of things that need to take place for your building to be a co-owned building. But if it is a co-owned building, and that would probably be most condominiums and some mixed-use developments in the last decade, then foreigners can own units there, and they can just own it in their own name, subject to some certain rules we'll talk about in a little bit. So the next question is, are co-owned buildings only condos? And I said it was similar to a condo. It could be condos, but co-owned buildings can be other kinds of buildings that also have a residential component. So you can see office towers with residential, retail with residential. So long as there's residential in that building, it could be a co-owned building. And I think in part when you look around Phnom Penh, you now see a lot of mixed-use developments. Again, you see residential condos with a retail mall or with an office building. And I think that's because then the entire development becomes a co-owned building. And then foreigners can own not just residential components, but they could also own retail components or commercial components like office space. As for foreigners owning in co-owned buildings, the next question is, can foreigners own units in co-owned buildings? And as I said previously, yes, foreigners can own units in co-owned buildings, and they can own it up to 70% of the floor space. So that does create some interesting dynamics. So if you're a foreigner and you own it, you can really sell it to anybody, because presumably, even if it's 30% owned by Cambodians and 70% owned by foreigners, if you own a unit, you could sell it to another foreigner, or you could sell it to a Cambodian. However, if you're a Cambodian and if you're in a building and 30% of the floor space is owned by Cambodians and 70% of the floor space is owned by foreigners, then you might get stuck in the sense that you could only sell to Cambodians, because if you sold to a foreigner, that would cause that ratio to be exceeded. So that's something to keep in mind. If you are Cambodian and you do own in a co-owned building, there could be some limits on who you sell to if that 70-30 ratio has already been achieved. Another point I want people to understand is, in addition to owning land, it's also possible to lease land in Cambodia. And in Cambodia, you have two kinds of leases. You have short-term leases and you have long-term leases, which is also called a perpetual lease. So for a lease to be considered a perpetual lease, the lease has to be 15 years or more. That would then be considered a long-term lease. Under Cambodia's civil code, the maximum duration of a lease is up to 50 years, and you are allowed one renewal. So I think this is also important for people to keep in mind for two reasons. One, for many, particularly industrial users, they might be happy to come in and take a long-term lease over land. Having a 50-year lease with an option to renew, that might be enough for them to meet their commercial objectives. Particularly, many special economic zones offer land for long-term lease arrangements. Also, I think it's good to know about a certificate of long-term lease. So if you do have a perpetual lease, a long-term lease, being a lease of 15 years or more, and you're leasing land, which is subject to a hard title, and that's something we're going to talk about a little bit later, then you can actually register your encumbrance, your long-term lease, on the certificate of title and receive a certificate of long-term lease. So having a certificate of long-term lease is very good evidence of your lease. It gives you a lot of protection. So it's something that is also, I think, very important for people to consider, particularly like industrial users or commercial users that maybe are willing to lease a piece of land for 50 years or more. The next topic I want to talk about is hard titles and soft titles. And these are terms that are commonly used in Cambodia. And it's important to understand the difference, because you can have different rights depending upon what kind of title you have. So let's start with hard titles. Hard titles are official certificates of title issued by the Ministry of Land Management, Urban Planning, and Construction, or some of their equivalent provincial and municipal equivalents. So typically, these are certificates of title issued by national or provincial authorities. They have officially demarcated boundaries. They have a certificate number on it, so they can easily be searched. Also, on certificates of title, on the back side, you can register encumbrances, mortgages, hypothecs, or long-term leases. So having a hard title is certainly the best evidence of ownership in Cambodia. Now, in Cambodia, they also have something called soft titles. Now, soft titles are actually not title documents at all. They're typically a certified sale and purchase agreement from the local authorities, where it transfers ownership, ownership, and I'll put that in quotes, over the property from one party to another. So for soft titles, because they are a certified sale and purchase agreement, typically there's no demarcated boundaries. On the backside, you cannot register encumbrances. It's more difficult to carry out searches. There's no official number, so it forces you to just go to the local authorities to deal with searches. And one of the really key issues is, it is possible to have conflicts between people that have a hard title for the land and for people that have the soft title. And that's because hard titles are issued by provincial or national and provincial authorities, and soft titles could be certified by local authorities. So if there's ever a conflict between persons that have a hard title and persons that have a soft title, the person having the soft title will lose out. So if you're looking at acquiring land, it's really important. It's best to have a hard title. If you do have a soft title, particularly for land, there are some processes to change that soft title into a hard title. There is a process where you can request the government to come out and to measure the land and demarcate the boundaries. The government also has some programs, and they will from time to time go and actually just go and measure land and issue these hard title certificates to people. So that's something to keep in mind. If you are dealing with land with a soft title, there's a lot of good reasons to have it converted into a hard title, and that is something that's typically possible. Now we're going to take a look at a hard title certificate, just so you can kind of see what it is and understand how they work. So for a hard title certificate, as I sort of highlighted, they have a number of features. So at the very top, as you'll see, starting at the top right-hand side, you'll see they have a certificate number, and that's usually at the top of the certificate. And that also makes it easy to search for the piece of land. You also have something that talks about the land size and the land use. So right there, you'll see there's a certificate number, there's a land size, and also the land use. So it could be agricultural land, it could be construction land. Looking at the left side of the certificate, you have land location, boundaries, and a QR code. So for the land location, it will have an address for the land, so you can understand where the land is located. Also, you'll see a picture that has some demarcated boundaries, so you can more easily understand the boundaries of the land and where it fits into the community. Lastly, the new certificates of title also have a QR code. Now, only the most recently issued certificates of title have a QR code. And what's important about the QR code is it really allows anybody to conduct a land title search. That QR code can be scanned, and based on that, you can obtain important information about the land. If there is no QR code, then you can still do a land title search, but you need to have the authority of the landowner. You need their approval to conduct a land title search. So in that sense, you need a lot more cooperation to conduct a land title search. If there is a QR code, you can just scan it and at least get some important information. Although still, you wouldn't be able to do a full land title search, but you could get some important information about who owns the land just based on the QR code. The next topic we're going to talk about is structuring real estate investments in Cambodia. So we're going to take that background. So it's going to be important to keep in mind the rules for land ownership, the rules for leases, hard title, soft titles, and we'll see how does this affect structuring issues in Cambodia. So first, we're going to start with Step one, the basic structure for owning land in Cambodia. So as we talked about, the rules are very simple. In order to own land, foreigners can't own land, but companies of Cambodian nationality can own land. And to be a company of Cambodian nationality, at least 51% of the shareholders have to be Cambodian citizens or other companies of Cambodian nationality. And then foreigners can own 49% of the shares. So in this slide, we have a very simple picture that just shows the shareholding of a landholding company, 51% Cambodian, 49% foreigner. Now, I do want to highlight for the 51% Cambodian, it is possible that does not have to be one person or one company. You could spread that out if you want to spread out risk. You could have 2, 3, 4. You could have as many Cambodian shareholders as you like. Typically, when people are creating these structures, they might have like 2 Cambodian shareholders. Maybe one owns 49%, another person owns 2% or 3%. Now, once you've gone ahead and set up a landholding company, where again, 51% is owned by Cambodians, 49% is owned by foreigners, then the next question is, how would you actually go about protecting the interests of the minority shareholder? So in order to protect the interests of the minority shareholder, typically the majority Cambodian shareholders and the minority foreign shareholders will enter into a package of agreements that are generally called land security documents. It's not an official name, but it's often used here in Cambodia. And under these documents, it will protect the interests of the minority foreign shareholder because they're typically the party that is paying for the land and paying for the development. So some of the agreements that might be used are things like a shareholders agreement. So there could be a shareholders agreement between the Cambodian shareholder and the foreign shareholder on how to operate the company. It might talk about issues like who is financing the purchases of the real estate, who gets to enjoy the profits from the real estate. There could be a loan and a hypothec agreement. So typically the foreign party is lending or is paying for the purchase price of the land. So the foreign shareholder would have to lend money to the company. So the company has the funds to purchase the land. In return, the company would agree to mortgage, or using the term in Cambodia, hypothecate the land to the foreign shareholder. So you might have a loan agreement from the foreign shareholder to the company, and then the company would agree to hypothecate the land to the foreign shareholder. Also in this structure, if you see, you have the landholding company, but if you look at the other side of the slide, you see a project company. So it's also possible that you have one company that owns the land and then a separate company that carries out the project. So let's use the example of like a garment factory. Perhaps a garment factory wants to acquire land for their factory. So they might set up a landholding company with their Cambodian partner to own the land. But then as for the running of the factory, that could be a completely separate company. And that could be 100% owned by foreigners because there's no restrictions on foreigners owning 100% of shares of most companies. So the foreigners could own the project company 100%. And then the project company could simply lease the land from the landholding company. And that could be a long-term lease. So as we said, a long-term lease could be for up to 50 years. And assuming the land is a certificate, is a hard title certificate, then on the backside, the lease could be recorded and the foreign project company could receive a certificate of long-term lease. So the point of this is to really see that once you start with something simple, the basic landholding company structure, you can really build on it. And you can build through a package of agreements and perhaps even having a project company. You can really build a structure which protects the interests of the minority foreign shareholder that is paying for the land. Now, I will just simply say, when you look at this, if you are trying to implement the structure, you don't necessarily need all of these documents or agreements. You might need some, and that's where you should really talk to a legal professional, and they can help you prepare an appropriate package of documents to protect your interests, Okay. So also we want to address, in addition to setting up a company, we also just want to talk a minute about how do you set up a company? What does that process look like? Is it an easy process or a difficult process? So I'm happy to report in Cambodia, it's relatively easy and straightforward to incorporate a company. For the company registration process, I like to think of it as a three-step process. First, in order to incorporate a company in Cambodia, you do need to obtain a registered office address. So that's sort of the beginning. You'll need to insert that in a lot of your application forms. You'll need to insert that in your articles of incorporation. So you need to have a registered office address in order to set up a company. So you can either use, you can go rent an office space. CBRE would be an outstanding partner to help you identify office space. Also, there are some service registered office address services if you just need the address temporarily until you really get up and running. So step one is to get a registered address. Then you need to register your company. So there is a new online system for registering companies where first you upload documents into the Ministry of Commerce company registration system, and then you later submit hard copies. Now, as part of this process, it has been streamlined. So when you upload, you're actually submitting documents for registration with three ministries. One, the Ministry of Commerce, and that's where your company will be incorporated. Two, the General Department of Taxation, and that's what will be registering for tax. And then three, at the Ministry of Labor. So that'll be necessary to register your company with the Ministry of Labor so that you can then go on and hire employees. Also, as part of the process, you'll need to open a bank account here in Cambodia. So once you've incorporated your company, you will get certain documents back that evidence that your company has been incorporated, and then you can take that to a bank for the purposes of opening a bank account. And then that bank account will have to be notified to the General Department of Taxation so they know what bank accounts you're using for your company. In terms of the requirements for setting up a company, they're quite easy to meet. And this is actually going back towards one of my first slides where I said Cambodia has a really friendly framework for investment. So in order to incorporate a company, the minimum registered share capital is $1,000, although we do recommend using at least $5,000, so there's no issues with the General Department of Taxation. Two, the minimum number of shareholders for a company is 1. Now, again, if you are trying to own land, you might need more than 1 shareholder, but the general rule for a company is you only need 1 shareholder. You only require 1 director. That director does not need to be resident in Cambodia and does not need to be a Cambodian citizen. So if foreigners want to set up a company or they want to set up a landholding company, they could have 1 director, and that 1 director could be a foreigner or could be a non-resident here in Cambodia. Also, there's no strict requirements for a corporate secretary. There are certain things under the law of commercial enterprise that a corporate secretary should do, but there's no formal requirement like in Singapore to appoint a company secretary. And then lastly, as I mentioned, you need to have a registered office address. You need a lease agreement to begin the company registration process. Also, that lease agreement needs to be in the Cambodian language, in Khmer. It can also be in English, but you need to submit a Khmer copy. One point I'd like to highlight about setting up companies, and I just want to highlight this because I see a lot of companies having this problem, and this would relate to landholding companies or other companies as well. And it goes towards shareholder loans and how do you actually finance the activities of your company. So as I mentioned also, one of the great things about Cambodia is there are no thin capitalization rules. The minimum requirement to incorporate a company is $1,000 or we recommend $5,000. But if you do incorporate a company with say $5,000, realistically, that's not enough money to really carry out your operations. Certainly, if you're looking at acquiring real estate, $5,000 is not enough money to acquire real estate. So if you have not fully capitalized your company, then it will be necessary for the shareholders or potentially a third party to lend the company money in order so that it can carry out its activities. Now, typically, shareholders will then lend the company money by way of a shareholder's loan, so the company has sufficient funds to carry out its activities. So one of the points that I want to highlight is previously, a lot of shareholders would lend the company money. They wouldn't document it. They would often have a no interest loan, but that caused all kinds of problems, and Cambodian regulations have changed. So now shareholder loans, they must have some interest, and it needs to be made on an arm's length basis, meaning it needs to be a commercial rate of interest. So we highly recommend that if you do want to set up a company, and if shareholders are pumping in money by way of loans, we highly recommend having written loan agreements, having rates of interest that are made on an arm's length basis, commercially reasonable amounts of interest, and then keeping that in your records in case you're ever audited by the General Department of Taxation. You can then clarify how the company has received funding, and that's very important for your tax compliance purposes. So this is, I think, a really important slide. It's really important for companies to get off, to start the right way. And one of the really key issues is just making sure that all your financing has been properly documented. I also want to mention, in addition to landholding companies, in 2018, the Cambodian government did issue a new law on trusts. And under this new regulation, it does allow for the creation of trust companies that are licensed with the Ministry of Economy and Finance. And there are now currently several trust companies in existence in Cambodia. And these trust companies can create trusts for commercial, for private purposes that do allow foreigners to own land. So the trust would own the land on your behalf, and then you'd have some sort of commercial agreement with the trust company regarding that land. So I will say, although the trust law did come out in 2018, there's only a small number of trust companies. I think they have not yet necessarily, I don't know if everybody's like fully comfortable with the trust companies, but I think it's something interesting. And I think it's a development that's really worth watching. And for certain kinds of projects, I think it might be worth looking into trusts. And you'd have to meet with the trust company. You'd have to like review all of their commercial arrangements and all of their agreements regarding the trust to see if it does adequately protect your interests. But I think for certain kinds of projects, particularly maybe smaller projects, maybe a smaller residential purchase, it would be worth looking into trusts, because I think that does also provide an alternative to landholding company structure. Now we're going to move on and talk about investment incentives for real estate. So again, one of the great things about Cambodia is that they do have investment incentives for certain kinds of projects. So we're going to go through what are those sorts of projects and what sort of investment incentives are available. So the first issue is, what kind of businesses qualify for investment incentives? And the answer is pretty simple. Any business qualifies for investment incentives, so long as it's not on the negative list. So that's really the key issue. What kind of businesses are on the negative list? And if you're asking what is a negative list, under the law of investment, there is a sub-decree on the implementation of the amendment on the law on investment, and there's a list, and it lists businesses that are not entitled to investment incentives. So as to the businesses on the negative list, I'll first start off and say things like professional services, trading, they're on the list, so you can't do that. Now, one of the interesting things that is on the negative list is real estate development. So you might be thinking to yourself, okay, so if real estate development is on the negative list, that means that you cannot get investment incentives for real estate. Why is Jay even mentioning it in this talk? I thought Jay said that there are investment incentives available for real estate development, and there you see real estate development on the negative list. The reason I included it is because that's true. There are no investment incentives for real estate development, and real estate development would be items like residential housing, just simply building a commercial office building or building a mall, something like that. If you just want to own that and build that, there are no investment incentives available. However, the reason I still say there are investment incentives for real estate is because for different kinds of real estate, there could be investment incentives. So let's take a look. So if you're a factory, if you're trying to acquire a piece of land and you want to build a factory, then that certainly relates to real estate. And if you're doing that, if you're building a factory, then investment incentives can be available. So for example, for the production of goods, food and beverage, textiles, furniture, you can see the list there. If you're building a factory to produce any of those goods, then investment incentives are available if you meet in certain minimum investment thresholds. So those investment thresholds range from 300,000 to $1 million. And if you're investing more than that, then investment incentives are available. So some of the other things that involve real estate where you can get investment incentives, trade centers or conference halls, schools. I know hotels are on the list. So if you're building a 2-star hotel, there are no investment incentives. But if you're building a 4-star hotel, 5-star hotel, then investment incentives can be available. So there you can see that, yes, even though real estate is on the negative list, there's lots of business activities that involve real estate that are on the list. So in order to get investment incentives, you have to register something called a qualified investment project. So to register a qualified investment project, you are registering that business and that investment with the Council for Development of Cambodia. So it's a little bit of a different registration process if you go through the Council for Development of Cambodia. So I just want to make that point clear. But they have the authority to then approve your project and then to grant investment incentives. So as for the kind of benefits that are currently available, you can get a tax holiday for up to 9 years, and that does depend upon the size of your investment, or special depreciation, which basically allows you to more quickly depreciate your investment under the tax law. You also can receive import duty exemptions. So if you need to import a lot of construction materials for your investment to build your factory, then you can get import duty exemptions. So I think it's actually a good package of incentives for companies that they're available to. Now, one of the key points I do want to highlight is that it's not quite as attractive as it looks. So while you can get a profit tax exemption for up to 9 years, that profit tax exemption is only valid so long as you keep the money in the company. The moment you want to pay that money out, pay those profits out, then there is a special tax that applies. And that special tax is exactly the same rate as a corporate income tax rate. So the special tax would be 20%, but then also the corporate income tax is also 20%. So I think the profit tax exemption, it's really valuable if you're keeping money in the company for growing, but as soon as you start paying that out in the form of dividends, then you basically get hit with the tax. That said, I think the package is still meaningful. You get import duty exemptions, so that will certainly make it reduce your costs in terms of building your hotel, building your factory. So they're still valuable to get, even if there are some taxes on paying out profits. I also want to highlight that the Cambodian government is reviewing the law of investment. There are some new draft law of investments, and we do anticipate that maybe in the next year or so, a new law of investment will be issued. Under the new law of investment, they also have similar, and I would even say better, investment incentives. So you also have profit tax exemptions. You also have accelerated depreciation, or there's even more potential income tax exemptions. So I think even if there is a new law of investment, the early drafts do indicate that you're going to have similar, if not better, investment incentives. Okay, so now we're going to turn to licensing for real estate developers, and we'll also look at construction permits as well. So for real estate licensing, the first question is, who needs a real estate development license? And it's only required in 3 situations. One, if you're doing the housing development business, so think about people that are doing ORAs, gated communities, residential housing, development of co-owned buildings. So again, this would be like condos or mixed-use developments where you're selling off some of those units. Also for sale of land plots, there are certain licenses required for that as well. Now, I do want to highlight, when you look at that list, who's not on that list. If you want to just simply buy a piece of land and you want to develop your own office tower, you don't need a real estate license. So really, the real estate licenses are only required if you're selling it off to the public. If you are building your own shopping mall, building your own commercial tower, just building your own factory, then you don't need a real estate license. It's only required in cases where you're selling it off to the public. For real estate licenses, there's 2 kinds of real estate licenses. You have something called a Type 1 license and a Type 2 license. And the licenses depend upon whether you are selling the real estate before completion or after completion. And different requirements apply depending. So for Type 1 licenses, it means you are selling you're selling your project, you're selling your residential development, you're selling units in your co-owned building on completion. So you've already completed the construction. For Type 2 licenses, it means you're selling it before construction is complete. So to take a look at it a little more deeply, I will say Type 1 licenses are much more lightly regulated. And the reason for that is because the construction has already been done. And then you're selling the units. So from the buyer's perspective, they're pretty protected. They know the project will complete. They can see the units. But for type 2 developers, that's more highly regulated, because in that case, the developer is selling the units before construction is complete. Often, the developer might also be funding the construction with some of the deposits paid by their customers. So for type 2 licenses, it's more highly regulated. As part of, in order to get a type 2 license, they need to open up a bank account with a bank in order to hold customer deposits. There's also obligations for the developer to have at least 20% of the capital required for the project. Also, they need to deposit, to make a deposit of at least 2% of the total construction costs in an account as well. So it's a more highly regulated, it's more highly regulated if you're on the type 2 side. There's also some restrictions on when you can sell the units for type 1 and type 2 developers as well. Okay, so after talking about the different kinds of developers, we're also going to talk about construction permits. So construction permits are obviously an important part of the construction process. Now, who is this relevant to? For the construction permit, I think if you are a real estate developer, you really need to consider the construction permit process. Also, I want to explain construction permits, because if you are acquiring real estate, you want to know, is the developer complying with their legal obligations? And then also, we're going to talk about due diligence later on. So it's really important to understand, like, what should you be looking for if you're doing due diligence on a property? What are some of the things that you need to look at? Now, I will say also, starting in 2020, the government came up with a new construction law. And in that, they put in a lot more details around construction permits and some of the things that are required before construction, during construction, and after construction. And that's what we're going to talk about today. If you're a developer, if you're a construction company and you're doing work for 2020, you had sort of like different requirements, but now they're much more clear under the new construction law. And the new construction law was introduced as a result of, there were some problems with buildings. There was 1 or 2 collapses of buildings. So they've really come up with a new set of construction rules, a new construction law, which really tightens the screws on the construction permit process. So let's take a look at what's required in the construction permit realm for construction compliance. So we're also going to look at 3 steps. Step 1 is prior to construction. So before construction, you need to have a construction permit. That's, of course, quite basic. And then before you begin construction, you need something called the construction site opening permit. So yes, the construction permit is where you're having your plans approved, but then before you actually start construction, of course, you need a permit to actually start bringing your equipment and machines on site. I will say, if in order to do the construction, you also have to demolish something on the land, then there's also separate permits as well for demolishing. So that's step 1. Step 2, during the construction progress, there are now certain obligations to submit progress reports to the Ministry of Land Management, Urban Planning, and Construction during the construction process. There's some concern this maybe has not been fully implemented yet, but it is a requirement under the law. So I think also if you're acquiring real estate or you are buying in a co-owned building, I think you can now start to ask the developer, where are these progress reports? We want to see what's being done. Then once the construction has been completed, there's a couple of things to look at. One, there should be a compliance certificate at the end of the process. So once the construction has been built, the Ministry of Land Management needs to assess to see whether the construction conforms to the construction permit, and they should issue a compliance certificate. That, I think, is a really key certificate. So certainly if you're buying in a new co-owned building, or you are engaging a construction company to build you a factory, you want to look to see, do they have a compliance certificate to ensure that the construction was built in compliance with the construction permit. Also, in addition to that, there should be a closing permit once the construction is finished. Once it's at an end, there's also a separate closing permit to confirm that construction is over. So again, depending on who you are, whether you are a construction company, these are important to know. You're also looking at acquiring real estate, and you want to make sure that the construction company, the developer, is complying with their construction compliance obligations. Then this list is really helpful as well. Another key issue is also tax issues with real estate. Of course, there are tax implications, so we're going to talk about some of those today. So there are really 4 key issues we want to look at when we look at taxes for real estate. 3 are on this slide, and then the 4th is on the next slide. So the 3 on this slide are land transfer taxes, unused land tax, and property taxes. So one thing to keep in mind is if you do transfer land, sell it, there is a 4% transfer on all land. There is a 4% tax on land transfers. Now, one of the really key issues, if you are a buyer of real estate, typically this tax is paid by the seller, but it is a point of negotiation. Now, sometimes when the seller pays that tax, they might try to pay less than the full 4% of the purchase price. The reason that's possible is if the sale price is unclear, there are some schedules for land that exist in the government, and they can sometimes value the land according to those schedules. Those valuations are typically a lot less than the actual sale price of the land. So sometimes a seller may try to pay the land transfer tax at some sort of lower rate. But to be very clear, from the buyer's perspective, that is not to your advantage. From the buyer, you want to have the full value of that real estate purchase recorded. You want to have tax receipts to protect you, so you can always show the tax department that the full 4% transfer tax was paid. And again, from your standpoint, you also, from like a capital gain standpoint, you want to record the full purchase price of that land. There's no incentive for you as the buyer to have the purchase price reduced, to have anything less than the full purchase price used for assessing the 4% transfer tax. So I think in sale and purchase agreements, it's really important to be clear. 1, who is paying that land transfer tax? And if it is a seller, to make sure they pay it on the full purchase price. And that, yeah, that's on the full purchase price, and that you receive evidence of that to ensure that all the transfer taxes have been paid. The next tax that exists is an unused land tax. So this is typically imposed on vacant land, or also land that has like abandoned buildings on it. So just to be clear, there is a cost for carrying vacant land. Within Phnom Penh, this has been certainly assessed. In some of the provinces, it may not have been fully implemented, but I think it's something to be aware of. If you are looking at land banking, acquiring large plots of land, there is a potential cost for just carrying this, and this is an unused land tax. So I think it's something that's really important to look into for the specific area where you're acquiring the land. Also, it's good to be aware that there are property taxes in Cambodia. Now, the property taxes are very low currently. It's 0.1% of the assessed value of the property. So that comes out to $1,000 per $1 million of valuation. So I think you look around regionally or in other countries, that's typically a really low rate. I think there is some likelihood that that rate will increase in the future because it is extremely low. But right now, it seems like it's quite manageable, 0.1% of the assessed value, so $1,000 per $1 million of valuation. There is also an exemption. The first $25,000, Khmer Real 100 million, is exempt from the tax. So if property is worth less than $25,000, no tax applies. But if it's more than that, you get an exemption on the first $25,000, and then the tax applies. There's been a very strong real estate market. So many plots of land, of course, have a value of more than $25,000. So I think for many people, it's likely that you would be paying some property taxes. The next tax I'd like to talk about is capital gains taxes. So there is under the new tax laws, there is a new capital gains tax. In some sense, it's always applied to companies because to the extent that you've sold something at a profit, that would always be taxed for companies. But it's also being implemented for individuals as well. So you now have a capital gains tax in Cambodia, and there are several ways of calculating that capital gains tax. So we're going to talk about the 3 possible ways that it could be calculated. First, you can choose like a gain on sale, and that's a 20% tax on any profits on the sale. So a very simple calculation. What did you pay for it? What did you sell it? That's your profit. There's a 20% capital gains tax. So that's just gain on the sale. But it is possible to look at, there's some other ways of calculating your capital gain. And you can choose. So the other one has to do with the expense deduction method. So of course, if you buy a piece of land, you just pay one price, you don't improve it, you've got no cost, and then you sell it, then okay, it's very simple to say gain on sale. What did you buy it at? What did you sell it at? But of course, if you have other kinds of real estate, maybe you have a commercial building, you might have to put in all kinds of improvements. You might have all kinds of costs. It could be sale and marketing costs. It could be improvements in the property. Maybe the property needs a new roof. So you have all kinds of costs. So then you might want to look at other methods for calculating what is your profit. It's maybe not so simple. It's not just a sale, the purchase price versus the sale price. So if you're looking at deducting your expenses, then you really have two options. One is called the actual expenses method. So for that, you can deduct your actual expenses. And for that, you have to evidence it. You should be keeping invoices, receipts, supporting documents to evidence what are your expenses. The other method is the deemed expenses method. And in that deemed expenses method, whatever your sale price is, they will deem that 80% of that sale price comprised various expenses, and that is deducted from the sale price. And then the capital gains is only levied on that 20% that remains. So that could be a very favorable method for calculating capital gains, particularly if you've owned a commercial building for a number of years, land prices have risen significantly, perhaps you don't have great records on all the expenses that you've poured into the property over the years, then you could use this deemed expenses method if you sold the property. And again, 80% of the sale price would be considered expenses, so that would be subtracted out. And then, the capital gains tax would only be levied on the remaining 20%. So again, I think it's really important to keep this in account. There is a capital gains tax, it's 20%, but there are some different methods. So I think you need to look at your specific situation to see what's the best way to calculate the tax. Lastly, we're going to come to the last part of our talk, and that's the due diligence on real estate. So this is really important for, I think, a number of individuals. One, certainly if you're just buying a piece of real estate, it's important to understand what kind of due diligence you should be doing on it. Also, we see this all the time in like an M&A context. Maybe you're buying some sort of asset, and of course, real estate is a component of that M&A transaction. So you also need to do a due diligence exercise on that piece of land as part of the larger M&A transaction. So these are just some points to consider for due diligence on real estate. So first is a land title search, and that's going back to what we talked about earlier. You have hard titles, soft titles. If there's a hard title, does it have a QR code? If it does, you can easily scan it and at least get some basic information. In order to do a formal land title search, previously, if you had certain information about the piece of land, you could initiate that search yourself. Now the rules have changed, and you actually need the landowner's consent. They need to sign off on the application form in order to do a land title search. So it's a little bit harder now to do a land title search. You'll need the consent of the landowner, but you can do a formal land title search if there's a hard title, and that's the best evidence of land ownership. You'll see who the owner is. You'll see if there's any encumbrances on the property. And that's the next step, encumbrances. It's really important to understand if there's any encumbrances, meaning does anybody else have any rights to that property? The two most common in Cambodia would be a mortgage or a hypothec. So perhaps the person acquired the property and they took out a bank loan. Well, if that's the case, the bank will have certain rights to that property, and you need to understand that. Also, there could be long-term leases. As we talked about earlier, you can have a long-term lease. So that can also be registered on the certificate of title. Certainly, if you're acquiring a piece of property, you'd want to know, does the bank have any sort of rights to that property? Has that property been leased to anybody pursuant to a long-term lease? If so, you can still acquire the property, but it's going to be subject to the bank's mortgage rights, hypothec rights. It's going to be subject to the lessee's rights as well. So you can still acquire the property, but you have to understand that other people have some rights as well. Another key issue to look at is whether whether an environmental impact assessment is required in connection with the property. So this is not something you'll see based on the land title, but I will say if you're acquiring a factory, you're acquiring certain kinds of developments, it may be required to have an environmental impact assessment. I think that's something you should think about, whether that's required. And if it is required, that's certainly something you can ask the seller to see if they've actually acquired that environmental impact assessment. Another thing to look at, of course, construction permits. If you're looking at acquiring a piece of land, acquiring a building, you'll want to know, was it built pursuant to a construction permit? Now, if you're looking at buying new buildings, then there should be a construction permit. If you're looking at older buildings, there may not be a construction permit. That might be lost. If you're looking at lovely old apartments on the riverside, there might not be a construction permit. If you're looking at older buildings, it's possible that it doesn't exist or they don't know where it is. It's been sort of like lost. In that case, and that's actually, I'm going to jump ahead to occupancy certificates. Under the new construction law, it does say that if a building does not have a construction permit, then it requires an occupancy permit to ensure that it's safe. So if you are acquiring a piece of land or you're acquiring a building, and you say to the seller, I want to see the construction permit just to make sure that the building has it, and they say, I'm sorry, I don't know where that construction permit is. I bought it from someone else. They never gave it to me. I don't know where it is. It doesn't exist anymore. Then under the construction law, you can require the building owner to get an occupancy permit, which ensures that the building is safe, and that occupancy permit is designed for buildings that don't have a construction permit. So I think that's a key new document, and I think that's going to be something that's really a hot issue going forward, is that when people are acquiring old buildings, they're going to be asking for these occupancy certificates. Also, if you're looking at acquiring a building, for example, you might want to look to see if there's other certificates that are required, particularly fire safety certificates. So we've had clients that are acquiring schools, there were older buildings. Certainly dealing with like children, it's highly important to make sure those buildings are safe. So it's very important to ensure that there's fire safety certificates for those buildings. So also for condominiums, for all kinds of constructions, that's something important as well. So that's an important point to look for. Also for property taxes, you can look to see, ask the seller to evidence that they've been paying property taxes. That would be something that you'd want to know, so they can provide property tax receipts, so you know that they've been paying their property taxes. Lastly, another due diligence point is licenses. So if you're acquiring, say, a residential unit in a co-owned building, you'll want to ask the developer, are you properly licensed? Do you have a type 1 license? Do you have a type 2 license? I mean, you also want to know that you're dealing with like a reputable company, a licensed developer, so you can ask to see what kind of license you have. Can you review that license? So those are the key due diligence points. That brings me to the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, I know CBRE is now going to give their presentation at the end. I'm more than happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. That was really interesting. We're getting a lot of good questions coming through already. So we'll rattle through CBRE's part of the presentation. My name's James Hodge. I'm Managing Director here at CBRE Cambodia. So we'll be talking today a little bit about some background. We've got a lot of both Cambodian, but also a lot of our foreign clients and some of Jay's foreign clients on the line today. So we just want to give a bit of context into market performance. We'll also be looking at some of the specific real estate sectors for Cambodia and how they've been doing, especially over the last quarter, as well as during the COVID-19 pandemic. We'll be looking quickly at some of the development dynamics that are happening in Cambodia, and we'll be talking about why we're talking about development in particular as we go through, and then also looking at some of the opportunities that we see at the moment. And whilst the market is certainly challenging, we'll be talking about some of the dynamics that are making it challenging. We'll be looking at maybe where we see some of the opportunities moving forward over this period of time and in the medium term. So I know that a lot of you have been asking Jay some really good questions already in the Q&A box. There's just a quick reminder of where to go to find it. And do please continue to post those. We'll be very happy to answer them. At the bottom of each question, there's a little thumbs up mark. If you like that question, you really want us to answer it, then do click that and it will just bring it to the top of the list so that Jay and I know which ones to focus on. Okay, without further ado, we will move on to get talking about some of the real estate fundamentals that we've been seeing in Cambodia recently. So CBRE, we always start off by looking at some of the really fundamental dynamics of the real estate sector. And in particular, here we're looking at GDP growth forecasts, which have moderated slightly over the last quarter, looking at inflation rates, which still remain stable here in Cambodia. I think probably the forecast for foreign arrivals is a little bit optimistic for 2021, given the status of the COVID-19 pandemic here and regional travel restrictions still remaining, as well as the speed of vaccinations in neighboring countries, will probably mean that we do not hit close to the 3.5 million traveler target that the government set in the latter part of last year. But beyond that, we're also seeing some more competitive lending and a slight fall in interest rates for savings here in Cambodia. So important to note that when we're thinking about saving rates in Cambodia, it's not unheard of to get 3 to 5, maybe 6% on deposits here, which is very strong, but it's offset by a pretty steamy lending rate. For a commercial loan, we might be looking at 6 to 9%. And for a mortgage, often we can see rates as high as 12%, but they are becoming a lot more competitive. The banking sector has really become much broader and more competitive. In terms of real estate indicators, I'm afraid that mostly our trajectory is pointing down, although there was a slight bounce in a couple of sectors over the course of Q1. So we saw high-end condo prices actually rise, and we saw office rents also rebound slightly. However, the indicators for the market suggest that both sectors are likely to come under some further pressure across the course of the year. So our trajectory identifier hasn't moved, and it's still pointing in a negative direction at the moment, although how much is still up for discussion. In terms of COVID, this is obviously a very hot topic for investors here. I want to understand how this is impacting us. And of course, it is hopefully something more of a short-term impact, but it is having an effect on the Cambodian market, and we can't get away without really touching on the topic. So the February 20th event has had a bit of an impact on us, a very considerable one, and started to eat into our liberties. But luckily, we are not yet close to what we're seeing from some neighboring countries in terms of their performance last year and the numbers that they were seeing, but the trajectory isn't positive. We're now well above the performance of Vietnam in terms of case numbers. And we can also see that mobility numbers have been trending at around minus 10 to 14 over the course of 2020, but they've now dipped quite strongly since the event in February. So this places some further pressure on the real estate market over the course of the next 12 months. And when we're thinking about investment, this creates some interesting lending and buying environments for investors looking at the Cambodian situation at the moment. So important context that we need to take into account when we're thinking about people's buying decisions at the moment and whether or not they are maybe looking to dispose of assets that investors may be interested in. In comparison, our GDP growth has generally been very strong over the long term. However, looking into the medium term, Cambodia's position is weaker. And we can see this in particular when we compare to the more diversified economy in Vietnam and the strength of its manufacturing sector. Whereas the more tourism-orientated Thai economy is certainly taking a much bigger hit during this period of time. But a really important point to note is that whilst, yes, Cambodia still lags those economies in terms of its level of development, many of the indicators that we're seeing for the potential of real estate investment here are pretty good. If we look at the growth here of Sihanoukville, it's quite an interesting case study and a pretty extreme example of the change that has happened to parts of Cambodia just since I arrived here about 5 years ago. So we went from a sleepy provincial backpacker town and fishing village to a mecca for Chinese gaming with huge volumes of construction. And now when you look at it, it actually looks like a relatively modern city, given that the roads have all been rehabilitated and put back on track. So whilst this is an extreme example, it's a good indicator of quite a lot of the things that we're seeing in Cambodia, and in particular, how Cambodia is gearing itself up for resurgent growth after the COVID-19 pandemic is receding. And infrastructure is key to that. So here we can see a few of the infrastructure projects that are going on with a focus on Sihanoukville and Phnom Penh, but there are various things happening across the country, different road upgrades, infrastructure investment reviews going on, especially with regards to mass transit and also additional expressway routes. And we know that in particular, the route down towards Ho Chi Minh City via Bavet is on the cards, as well as some kind of monorail or mass transit solution for Phnom Penh. But even though quite a lot of those larger projects remain a little way off, we've still got some pretty interesting stuff going on, including large airports, new airports, and also airport expansions. So in particular, the airport in the southern part of Phnom Penh in Kandal province, and also in Siem Reap, as well as the third ring road, which is really starting to have a big impact on the shape of development and the future development path for Phnom Penh, and some really important critical infrastructure upgrades like the Chom Chao overpass. So important to note these items. Cambodia's level of development means that whilst we have some way to go in terms of catching up and producing an infrastructure backbone that is as robust as neighboring countries and therefore can support the weight of investment that Cambodia would like to see. It is on the way, and this is quite a major period of time in terms of the trajectory for Cambodia's growth and development. So from an investor's perspective, these are super important things to be watching and thinking about how is this going to change the pattern of people's living habits, where they work, what they might be doing in the future. The fact that Cambodia is coming from behind may allow them to leapfrog slightly what we have seen in other markets in terms of development. So we look at what's happened with Sihanoukville again with its infrastructure upgrades. Those pieces of infrastructure have been inbuilt with various pieces of technology to try and help the province to manage traffic flow and crime and all these things better. And if Cambodia can introduce this kind of smart infrastructure as a first step, rather than going through the usual development path, then potentially the capacity and resilience of that infrastructure can be much better than we might have seen, and it can help Cambodia to grow even quicker. In terms of news, this is also something that we look at when we think about the context for Cambodia, and Cambodia doesn't always get the best press, particularly if you look at some of the Western newspapers. But there are some really key topics to keep an eye on for Cambodia. And these are in particular the de-dollarization push from the National Bank and the Ministry of Economy and Finance. There is a possible upside in there for developers if the local currency can perform well, then they may get an additional benefit from the fact that the Khmer Real is becoming more of a core currency for Cambodia. Obviously, there are the usual stories around corruption, money laundering, all of these things that we need to take very seriously and take into account and ensure that all that due diligence stuff is followed properly, and that we're dotting the I's and crossing the T's at every single turn. But some interesting news, the issue that we've seen in Myanmar recently is obviously incredibly sad, but it also creates opportunity for Cambodia. There are investors from Myanmar who've started to look at this market as potential for their projects that have not been able to move forward there. And also good to note and keep in the back of the mind for investors is resiliency to climate change. And Cambodia lacks some of that resiliency at the moment, and it can create risk. So again, something to think about when you're looking at purchasing a land plot for development or a building. How well is it protected for flooding? Does it have the capacity properly to withstand higher winds and additional rain? So we've been seeing more extreme weather even here with droughts and flooding and more extreme storms. And in comparison with the region, we also try to think about the context of the development environment and the business environment itself. So we look at brands and we look at Fortune 500 companies, and we try to think about how Cambodia is developing in this respect. Now, the good news for many smaller investors is that we do not have the institutional investors here in Cambodia. So we don't have the likes of BlackRock, Blackstone, Keppel, or GIC active here, whereas they are in Vietnam or Thailand, and that makes those markets considerably more competitive when you're looking at a mid to large scale project. Buying a site when you're up against one of these guys is very difficult, but Cambodia, you don't necessarily have that dynamic being faced, and it is more about mid to small scale investors from other markets that are jumping in as a first wave here. Of course, we do have some more established names here like Oxley and Hong Kong Land, and broader beyond that, we have seen a proliferation of more brands joining this market. So we're looking at an increasing number of hotel brands coming in. There are more retailers, particularly in the food and beverage space and in luxury goods. I think Cambodia was the first and maybe still the only Southeast Asian country to have a Rolls-Royce dealership itself, which is maybe an indication of where Cambodians are spending their money at the moment, and maybe not an indicator of greatness for the real estate sector, but it indicates the level of spending and disposable income in certain sectors of the society. But we still have a way to go in terms of attracting other developers and brands from other markets. And this is also just giving you some additional context. So here we are looking at some of the things our clients are telling us. We ask them regularly to update us on their thoughts about the market and the economy and how things have moved over the course of the last little while. We've been doing this now for about 18 months. Over the course of 2020, what we saw was an increase in people's fears around construction delays and reduction in liquidity, whereas oversupply and infrastructure capacity remained pretty consistently high in terms of their identification of what was a risk for real estate. We also saw a compression of people's views of the market. So we saw major improvement and major deterioration of the economic situation grow. So the extremes of the situation were increased over the year. And really interestingly, just giving an indication of the market dynamics, this is in the bottom left-hand side of the screen. You will see change in sentiment. Really important here to note this isn't people's intention necessarily, but the change in their view of the sectors. So whilst landed property and land remain very high up on people's agenda for investment, office struggled the most in people's view of how sectors had changed. And it really dropped back. And we think that that was due to the reorganization of rental rates that we saw over the course of the last year as landlords started to react to the competition in the market, whereas condominiums really pulled away in terms of people's view of investment sentiment, and likely due to some changing long-term trends in terms of demographics, as well as the affordability of that sector, and we'll get on to that shortly. Okay, just a quick one. I would try and focus our attention today on how the indicators for the real estate sector play out from an investor's perspective. But really important to note here that competition in the Cambodian market remains pretty fierce. CBRE track almost 280 construction projects that are undergoing construction at the moment. Around 10% of those projects are currently on hold, but still remains an awful lot of projects which are being built, and a lot of supply that is due across the board. So there is more fierce competition here, but it also creates potential for opportunities if you look in the right location. There was a very big movement to new projects over the course of 2017 and 2018, and many of those projects remain under construction at the current time. Certainly 2020 and the supply chain issues in construction that we saw have slowed some of those projects and pushed them later into this year, next year. But the majority remain ongoing, at least, and a good proportion of them have partially completed, with more stock due to enter the market through phasing of projects. In terms of construction projects that are on hold, most of those are at the core stage. Some have already topped out, but very few of them have gone beyond that to the more expensive stages of construction. So there are a number of opportunities that we see upcoming with development projects that have been partially completed, but maybe where funding is not allowing that developer to continue on with that project. We expect some of those to be more widely available on the market over the course of this year. And for some developers who maybe want to come in and have the ability to finish projects and see an opportunity to do something, those may be a new opportunity, whereas traditionally Phnom Penh and Cambodia have been very much the preserve of developers. In terms of condominiums, this is a sector that has been having a lot of news attention over the last 5 years. We've been talking about oversupply in this sector for that period of time. Really, the sales prices don't hold that is the case, and it's probably due to the fact that supply has been much slower to enter the market than previously expected. However, 2020 did see quite an impact on sale prices, in particular for the high-end and mid-range segments, whereas the affordable market continued to rise. And that really was because the dynamics of the market changed, in that domestic buyers became the target for developers. And there is a much broader group of Cambodians able to purchase at the affordable pricing level rather than mid-range or high-end. So some key things to think about there. It has changed the dynamics in terms of what people are looking to supply. So the launches have now changed in the condominium sector, and we've been seeing more affordable projects on the edge of the city being launched. Now, some investors might consider that is the way to go. Others might look at it and think, actually, you know what, I think that the economy will pick up quite strongly in the next few years, and it was probably better to go to the high-end sector of the market in the city centre and do something that's beyond what is currently completed in Phnom Penh, in order to attract the really luxury side of the industry. So whilst the indicators are that affordable is doing well, when we look further into the future, the dynamics of supply and demand mean that maybe there are future opportunities in other sectors as well as in the affordable condo markets. Offices have taken a pretty big hit over the course of 2020, and this was due to a big influx of new supply, particularly in the Grade B sector. Over the course of this year, we also expect a big influx of new supply, probably about 200,000 square meters of space being added to the market, most of which is strata title stock, which is really a new thing. So this is a co-owned building type. As Jay was talking about, you have multiple different owners who own different units within the property, and they are in some cases looking at competing against each other to lease out that space. So far, the strata title market hasn't grown sufficiently to really start to indicate the performance of those projects. However, the occupancy rate in the office market at the moment and the rental dynamics mean that investors are having to be very, very competitive with their negotiations in order to close deals. This is creating some issues for a few strata title owners where they had bought in a market that was much stronger. So if you look at what was happening to the office market in 2017, 2018, 2019, where rents were growing very, very strongly during that period of time, so the graph on the right-hand side. And then what happened over the course of 2020, where it dropped back really to 2016, 2015 levels. That was a very swift change, and it was taking some time for strata title owners to realize the extent of that and react to it, which is anticipated and something that I know that tenants were grateful for, because we saw some uptick in deal rates across the first quarter. So business starting to make some decisions and move forward. The office market is still relatively small by regional standards, but the potential for growth is quite dramatic. The occupancy rate does need to grow. We don't see deal sizes equivalent to what we would see in the likes of Vietnam, where an average deal might be 1,000 square meters. Here we're looking at something in the order of 200 to 220 square meters as the average. And that has dropped quite considerably since over the course of 2020. So from about 275 back by about 50 square meters per deal, indicating a scaling back from some in the sector. In terms of retail, this has been a very popular market for different developers to get into, and particular here we're looking at the community mall segment. There's been a big proliferation of new projects in community malls, and it's obviously important to check that the retail sector right now has a lot of competition, and we've been seeing some compression of rental rates across the board over the course of, particularly of the last year, but also further back than that as competition in the sector rises. In terms of retail, the sector is pretty underdeveloped in terms of consumer trends and also retail operations compared to many of our regional counterparts. So there is some potential there, but mostly on the operational side of things, rather than necessarily in development. And it's more about diversification in the retail sector in order to grow rental rates and occupancy and deliver footfall. And there have been some really key dynamics that have been changing in the retail sector over the course of 2020, particularly with regards to the F&B industry. And that no doubt will be accelerated as we go through this period of time where restaurants have been asked to close due to COVID-19 restrictions. Okay, just quickly, we'll talk about development dynamics. For the Cambodian market, development remains the primary form of investment at the top level of the segment of the real estate markets. So if you're a bigger investor who's looking to make a return out of Cambodia, the traditional way is to purchase a land plot using a landholding company structure or a leasehold, or potentially through a citizenship route, and look at realizing a development gain. We are seeing this change slightly, and I'll talk about that in the next segment, but in particular, development has been the real driving force for investors here to date. But if we look at Cambodia and its development so far, you can see that in terms of our scale and height, we are still below many of the region's other major cities. And here is a comparison in terms of building heights. And Cambodia is still quite some way below the average, although it's catching up quite quickly. I think over the course of this year, we will see at least 2 completions that are of a taller nature than Vatanak Capital Tower. So just as an indicator of how Cambodia has been developing, certainly very, very quickly and catching up, but quite some way to go in terms of its ambition level when we look at what's happened across the Asia Pacific region. We also look and think carefully about the wave of developers that have come in, and typically it is like a wave. Back in 2007, 2008, it really was the preserve of local companies, and then after the global financial crisis, and also partly during it, the Koreans started to develop after they'd been doing some land site purchasing before the global financial crisis. That has then moved into quite a big chunk of development being in the Chinese sphere of influence, and we've seen a lot more diversification from developer origins. But as I talked about in terms of institutional investors, they are not really present here in Cambodia at the moment, and it is more the preserve of mid to small scale operators. And when we look at the type of project that's being built, here we're focusing on what we call tall buildings, so anything over 18 stories, and most of those have been in the residential sector, and that really has been what has been driving growth. But when we look into the future over the course of 2022 to 2024, the mixed use portion of the market and also the commercial portion of the market is growing quite quickly. So here we're looking at office buildings and buildings which are containing probably residential, maybe hotel, and probably some form of retail or office usage as a way of diversifying the project. So these are some key trends that we've been looking at in the development sector over the course of the early part of this year and the latter part of last year, and thinking about how is this impacting development in Cambodia, and how is this having an impact on development, the nature of development and development returns. And we also start to factor in here land prices and how the supply in Cambodia is impacting return. So when we look at the districts in Phnom Penh, you've got the central districts here if you look at the chart on the left-hand side, the areas on the left are really the core districts. So here we're looking at Cham Kalmon, BKK, Dom Pen, Seven Makara, and now really we could probably add most of Tul Kork into that district, into that definition of central districts. So the land prices there are typically at least $4,000 a square meter on average. And we can see that whilst the average number of floors across the market is relatively consistent, the density of tall buildings in those districts is much higher now, as well as some of the more developed districts like Sensok and Choi Chang Va, where there has been improvement of infrastructure and lots of available land to allow bigger developments to happen. When we think about development return and the optimum density and how to realize profit in the Cambodian market. There's so many factors that are going into it, and really needs a very scientific, focused approach in order to ensure that you're getting the most out of a potential development. So land price is obviously critical, and that is why we've started to see a movement towards the edge of the city, and a proliferation of more affordable projects with equal level, really, of density in most cases to realize the returns that were available previously. To central locations where land prices have continued to rise. If we look at the average price rise for land plots in the city centre over the course of the last decade, they've averaged between 10 and 12% most years, which is a pretty staggering return, even if you have to pay some vacant land use tax. But the development terms returns are still certainly possible in Phnom Penh if you are prepared to build anything over 15 stories, and for most you would be looking to optimize at somewhere around 30. So these are not small projects, and they take a fair amount of capital to realize. Most of that capital is not coming from domestic banks. They don't necessarily have the reserve of capital to help developers to deliver that kind of scale of project. So we're seeing more lending from overseas and also other sources. In particular, pre-sales helping many projects, which is also why we see a proliferation of strata title projects. So this creates a couple of dynamics for different investor groups. Firstly, for developers and larger scale investors. The future for core assets in the city that you can pick up once they are well occupied and completed is going to be relatively small in Phnom Penh, because most of the incoming supply is strata title. And that is so that developers can help to pre-fund their project. If you are a consumer investor, so if you're looking at buying a strata title unit, maybe that is a condominium or an office, then there's certainly a lot of choice, but there are risks out there to consider and weigh up. But the potential at the moment is certainly that there is a lot of competition and you can get an excellent deal. And the dynamics of this market mean that the future economy is looking pretty rosy, given the expected return to strong GDP growth, as well as through the investments that are being made during this period of time in infrastructure. So some really key aspects to consider when making decisions about development, the type of development that you want to do, the purpose of it, how you're going to fund it. And when you're buying an investment, so key to look at some of those driving factors from the developer's perspective and think about how those might impact your future returns. So where do we see the opportunities here in Cambodia at the moment? Well, I think there are still some less crowded sectors out there in the real estate market. And here I'm identifying industrial and logistics as one area where we haven't seen a great deal of foreign interaction yet. It's a little bit surprising, but some of the financial models that have been used in the sector are not particularly optimized for how foreign industrial and logistics developers like to operate. So hopefully we will see more of that as the sector matures a little bit. But there are a few other sectors here as well. So we're looking now at a stronger growth in a push towards alternatives. So hospitals, education, and even data centers to a certain extent. It's a little bit early for that, but certainly the pandemic has created more demand, particularly for healthcare and for education here domestically, but also for things like retirement housing. I don't think we're there yet with student housing. The dynamics of the Cambodian lifestyle don't necessarily lend themselves to that, but certainly there has been a broadening and deepening of alternative sectors over the course of the last 12 months. We see a lot of potential for technology. Other markets and industries have been pioneering a lot of connected tech that can help real estate to be more efficient. And in a market where there is threat of oversupply quite broadly, technology can help to create a point of differentiation. Host is actually a system that CBRE use, and largely we've been rolling that out in the US and Australia. So hopefully you watch this space. Do things differently. I think that is key in a market where we are seeing a lot of development happening, and we have been for some time, but a lot of it is very similar. And having a think about how to make your project stand out from the crowd is likely to be more successful at the moment. And lastly, be very quantitative and systematic in your approach to development. There's a great deal of risk, and it needs to be considered carefully. Need to think about the operational model, need to think about the investment model for the future. How are you going to realize your return or maintain your cash flow and ensure that your reputation is upheld given the risk in the market? So there are some core aspects to really consider when thinking about investing and developing here. How can you get into it? What model is best for you? And where to put your capital. So a lot of information available now compared to previously, which is a good thing for all of us. We just need to make sure that it's being used properly and efficiently, and that the assumptions being made are clear and helpful. And why is now the time? Just to sum up, I think there is a lot of potential for the availability of investment assets to improve, and that is likely to be in the format of more land plots, particularly on the edge of the city where they're owned by smaller to mid-size investors who maybe are experiencing some cash flow struggles, especially this year after the extent of a slower economy. Cambodia is used to growing at 7% a year. People's outgoings are pretty high, and they've really had to learn how to manage those over the course of the last 12 months without the typical growth that they see in terms of revenue. So this is a really important point, and I think we're likely to see that changing. We haven't yet. We have a lot of investors on our books looking for what they call distressed assets, but not much to offer them yet. But that could change, and it's also linked to point 3, which is refinancing and reviews of lending terms. In the middle of 2020, the banks were encouraged by the National Bank to soften the terms of the loans that they had out with many investors and property owners, and a lot of those are due for renewal or a kind of review in the middle of the year, and that may push some to looking at selling soon. It's definitely a buyer's market. There are quite a lot of assets available in certain sectors, particularly if we look at maybe the hotel segment in Siem Reap at the moment, or if we look at some of the condo market. The condo market now, very competitive. If you're looking at picking up an asset there, you can really negotiate quite hard, and we're seeing frequently discounts of 20, 30% being regularly offered, as well as softer lending terms, sometimes loans from the developer themselves, and much more favorable lending and buying terms, payment terms, which can be quite appealing. And if we look beyond this immediate period of time, there is a view that Cambodia will return to its strong growth path. There are some really interesting things going on with infrastructure, which show that the future for Cambodia's businesses looks pretty strong, and we'll be able to get things around the country easier. There is some potential upside with regards to currency and de-dollarization. We just have to look very closely and be very confident about it. and the demographics of Cambodia are very strong indicators for future potential. The young population here is pretty dynamic, and we've got lots of things going for the Cambodian economy for the future, and that won't go away anytime soon. So that's a very quick run through on real estate investment. It is challenging to be so specific on the investment market here because it's very broad, but I'd be very happy to take any questions that you've got, and we'll see whether we can give you a more specific answer to any queries that you've got regarding certain sectors or types of investments. But I think we have quite a few questions for Jay to start with, so we will kick off with one of those. Please do keep writing your queries in the Q&A box. All right, let's find one. Okay, we have one with five likes on it. Jay, welcome back.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I can see there's a lot of great questions people are asking.
Absolutely.
So I can certainly start with the question that has 5 likes. So the question is, if the Cambodian shareholder in the land structure dies, assuming an individual, does that become problematic? Or are there protections surrounding that? That's a great question. And the answer is yes, that is problematic. You have a shareholder who's an individual. If that person passes away, then somebody has the right to inherit that person's shares. So I think to control for that, when you create a landholding structure, that's why it's really important to think about what sort of documents do you need in place to protect against things like that. So that could be in part a shareholders agreement that addresses what happens if people pass away. Also, I think it's really good to consider wills for individuals if they're going to be owning shares, because that would also give them a certain amount of power to clarify what they want to have happen with those shares. So, I mean, there's a lot of rules around giving gifts and wills. That's a little bit beyond this talk, but I think the key point is, yes, you should give it some thought. You should look at the land security documents and try to put together a package that protects you. Also, you might want to consider, instead of having one Cambodian shareholder hold all 51%, maybe you want to split it up between 2 or 3 Cambodian shareholders. So in case one person passes away and there are some issues dealing with that person's estate, the minority foreign shareholder, they still have 49%, and they and their other Cambodian partners still have a majority of the shares, and the company can sort of move forward.
Yeah, yes, super important. Obviously, we hope that doesn't happen, but it can, and obviously does. So important to protect against that. Okay, there's one question here. Will the presentations be available? Yes, we'll make sure they get sent out, and I think we'll be able to upload this to YouTube. It'll probably just take us a few hours. It's a fairly lengthy one, so bear with us, and we'll make sure that we get that over to you by the end of the day. Okay, Jay, how long does it normally take to do a land title search, and do you know how much the fees are?
So if you do,
yeah,
that's a great question. Typically, it takes several weeks to conduct a land title search. So there is an application form. As mentioned, you will need the landowner to sign off on that form as well. That can be submitted at the Ministry of Land Management, Urban Planning and Construction. It could take several weeks. It could take a month. A little bit depends on processing times. With COVID-19, of course, timelines might be extended.
Of course.
Also, in terms of the cost, you're looking at around $50–60 US of an official filing fee to do a land title search. Also, as to your questions, when you do get the search results, it will say who the owner of the property is. It'll describe the size, the location, and it will specifically address whether there are any encumbrances on the property. And again, the encumbrances would either be a hypothec agreement or a long-term lease agreement.
Excellent. Thank you. One question actually from one of my colleagues, but it's got lots of likes, so we'll run with that one. In the case of a Type 2 license holder, if they go bankrupt, so this would be the construction the sales license, right? So if they're building and it's a speculative construction, they're building and they're trying to sell at the same time, they go bankrupt or they're unable to finish construction, is there any protection or compensation for the buyers of the building? Who will be responsible for the compensation?
That's a really great question. And it's a really difficult question. It's a very difficult question as well. So for the type 2 developer, it is more regulated. So as mentioned in the discussion, they have to they should have 20% of the capital of the construction. They need to put in like 2% of the construction costs into a separate account that's held until the end of the construction. But aside from that, and there's also some other rules. For example, they can't start selling units until they have a construction permit, things like that. There aren't a lot of other protections, and that is a risk. And I think it's worth considering that because if the developer does go bankrupt, then they have to fall under there's a law of insolvency, and that will sort of dictate what happens from that point forward, where the assets of the developer potentially could be sold off, and then anybody that has claims would be paid out. Now in Cambodia, there's been very few insolvencies. I can't say I've seen any developers follow that path, but in a general sense, if a company goes insolvent, that's what happens. There have been some cases in Cambodia where projects have stalled out, where developers seem to have run out of money. And I think in those cases, there seems to be a lot of like commercial discussions between people that have put forward deposits and the developers, and they try to find some sort of solution to go forward. But I think that definitely is an area to be concerned, where it's probably better to deal with strong developers, people that have a track record. Because when you say who's liable for compensation, well, again, in any sort of commercial transaction, the person liable for compensation is the developer, the company that you have a contract with, right? I mean, they're the ones that are liable for compensation. So to the extent that they have money, then they can pay out that compensation. To the extent that they don't have money, then you get into a difficult situation where potentially they could be insolvent. So that's a great question, but it's a difficult question.
Yeah, one that this period of time might give us more of an answer to, in the fact that more developers are struggling. It's quite common when we go through these kind of market cycles to see empty buildings resulting from it. We've still got empty buildings if you go to Ho Chi Minh City, or even some here from the GFC and the fallout from that. And obviously people are still trying to take those forward, but it takes an awfully long time. And the longer those projects linger around, the more costly they become. The interest rates rack up on their construction loans. It becomes increasingly challenging for them to continue. So probably some lenders also looking to stick their oar in on some of those if we do see more instances of that coming through, but probably something that we will see more of, I'm afraid, in the next year or two. Okay, as an individual investor, are you subject to any income taxes on rental income, Jay? I think this is withholding tax, isn't it?
That's a really good question. The answer is yes and no. So in theory, all persons are subject to have to pay income taxes. However, they've not been fully implemented for individuals. So if you are an individual person, like just a natural person, there is some possibility that the law technically requires you to pay income taxes on your income and your revenue. However, there's no mechanism to pay that for the moment. So I think long term, you should be assuming that you will be having to pay like full income taxes on any sort of like revenue. Also, depending upon who your tenant is, withholding taxes may apply if you are not registered with if you as the landlord are not registered with the tax authorities.
Thank you. Okay, a few more to go. I think there's still some popular ones on here, but I'm aware that we've got only about 10 minutes to go, so we'll crack on. Right, if I want to clarify on the tax on dividend payment for non-resident investors, is it supposed to be the same as other withholding taxes at the rate of 14%? Can we clarify?
Yes, that's a great question about withholding taxes. So first off, let me just say for companies, there's a 20% corporate income tax, which is also the same as a capital gains tax. But in addition to paying income tax, there's also withholding tax on dividend payments to non-residents. So if you have a company, step one, they have to pay their profit tax. And then with whatever money remains, if they want to pay out a dividend, it would be subject to withholding tax of 14%. And that dividend is made to a non-resident.
Excellent, thank you. I did also see a question earlier about capital gains tax and whether or not receipts should be kept. And the answer is yes, keep absolutely everything relating to the expenses on your property. If you own it personally, that might be the best way to do it. But if you don't have all your receipts, you still have the 80% option. So you can write down 80% of the proceeds and pay just on the 20%. So effectively a rate of 4%.
I will say there are also some carve-outs for residential real estate. So if you are owning your own home, there are some carve-outs to the capital gains taxes. That's not something I really addressed. But if you are a residential unit, that might help you in some ways.
Okay, one more on land transfer taxes. What are the implications if the seller pays based on the government's assessed value and it's lower than the value in the sales and purchase agreement?
I think there could be a potential problem. And I think the potential problem is, on one hand, you've got one party to the transaction declaring a certain value to the tax department, which is not correct. And then you have the buyer who at a later stage might be declaring another value to the tax department. So to me, I see an inconsistency, right? The seller is declaring a low value, the buyer is declaring a high value. And I think like an easy audit point for the tax department will be to the buyer when they go to sell the real estate to say, okay, let's see the land transfer tax receipts. Let's see what the assessed value was when you acquired the property. And if that document says that your cost basis is much lower than what you're claiming, I think that's a real easy inconsistency. I think it's a potential trap. And again, as the buyer, you want, because you will have to pay capital gains if you sell it, you want to declare the full price. You want that price to be as high as possible because that's the price that you paid. And that will be relevant when you have to pay capital gains taxes. The seller might have a different idea. They just want to pay that tax, get through the transaction as cheaply as possible, so they don't really care in the same kind of way that you do. So I think it's a really important point and something to really watch out for.
Yeah, absolutely. And definitely comes back to the dynamics of the market. So if you're in a buyer's market, maybe you have the opportunity to negotiate that out. But if you're facing a stronger seller, then your negotiation on that point is going to be pretty tough. But definitely something maybe to take a look at. Okay, how long does it normally take to do a land title search? Oh, I think we've done that one already. Let's clear that one. Okay, most people buy land in Cambodia, but this gentleman or lady is a foreigner. They can't invest in land. What are the best options? And there's also a comment on there about guaranteed rental returns, which I'll come back to. But what would you say the best options are, Jay? I'm assuming that it's varying by the scale of the project.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you have to just sort of bring a commercial analysis, like what's an appropriate, what's a good investment for yourself. So I know James certainly talked about that. I think Seabury would be a great choice to talk to them about what are appropriate projects. In a general sense for foreigners, I'll just simply say, if you want to buy land, you're looking at land holding companies, and there actually are a lot of complexities around them, also compliance obligations for those companies. But I think for certain large scale projects, it's certainly worth doing. There are new trust arrangements. Again, I think they're relatively new, but I think for certain kinds of maybe smaller projects, or maybe for an individual, it might be worth looking at. But then of course there's co-owned buildings. So if you want to own a condo, you want to own an office and lease that out, you want to own a retail space, then I think you look at co-owned buildings. You can just own that yourself, 100% it's yours, and then that's a very easy investment. So I think, for many investors, the co-owned building space is certainly the easiest, most straightforward, most comfortable. If you're willing to take on either more, a little bit more complexity, a little bit more risk, I think then you can look at things like trust or setting up your own land holding company.
Yeah, absolutely. Guaranteed rental returns are a really hot topic at the moment, and something that we've been talking about a great deal in the last 6 months or so. But there is obviously a lot of pressure at the moment on developers who have been offering guaranteed rental returns back in the really strong market days of 2018, 2019. So they've been offering 6 to 8% a year returns at prices that were stronger maybe than they are now. And this can create some issues for their cash flow. It's not natural for a developer to hold large amounts of cash in their bank account in order to pay back guaranteed rental returns, even if they say they built it into the sales price. They're usually spending that money on their next project, not holding it to pay out back to people who bought their project. So they're gambling on being able to make an appropriate rental return from tenants. And that is more challenging now. So it's creating, I think, some difficulties for some who've offered guaranteed rental returns. But really, this comes back to a similar answer to what Jay gave in the question about the type 2 sales licenses, in that it's a contract between you and the person who's offering the guaranteed rental return. And if they're not able to meet their obligations, then there are various processes and procedures to go through with regards to insolvency and whether or not you can get your money back another way. I don't know whether you've got any thoughts on that, Jay, if you've heard of any issues or know anything else about that.
I think you expressed it really, really well. I mean, you have a contract with the developer, and it's a commercial agreement. And if they're unable to pay, then it's a breach of contract, and you're either pursuing breach of contract claims against them, or potentially even, if the developer is insolvent, you could go down that route. But I agree. I think, again, a guaranteed rate of return is as good as the developer behind it. And if they, have the funds and they're able to make those payments, then terrific. If not, then again, you have a commercial agreement and you have to sort of pursue breach of contract claims against them.
Yeah, doesn't sound very fun, but again, I think there's a bit of risk out there at the moment around these. So I think we'll watch that one very, very closely, and probably expect to see some examples, unfortunately, in the not too distant future. Okay, construction permits. Who is responsible for carrying out the compliance certificates? Is it a government body or does a registered third party do them? When did the compliance certificate become a requirement for buildings from?
That's a great question. So, I mean, the government, the Ministry of Land Management carries out, they issue the compliance certificate. So it's not like an independent third party, it is like the government. In terms of when did it become a requirement, I will say under the new construction law, which came out in 2019, not 2020, as I maybe said earlier, it's listed in the new construction law. So it's a requirement, certainly from like 2019 onwards.
Great. Okay, I think we've got time for probably 2 more questions. And we've got a lot of questions here on taxes. So I don't know whether you want to cover those, Jay, or if you want us to try and find something else.
Well, I will maybe just to make a high-level comment. I see there's a question on what are the risks and costs, tax implications of landholding company as compared to landholding individual option. And let me just maybe address this at a high level. Certainly, if you have the option, if you're a Cambodian citizen and you have the option of owning land in your name, that's the easiest. That's very simple. If you have a company, a landholding company, I think also before you jump into any of these structures, you should really talk to like a legal counsel and understand the compliance obligations of having a company. Also, I would recommend talking to an accounting firm as well to understand like all the tax implications surrounding having a company. Particularly if you're doing like a real estate development project, that company is going to need to be appropriately funded. They're going to have a lot of tax compliance obligations. So I think you have to really understand this before you like jump into the structure. And that's where I tend to think if you're like a big commercial developer, it makes a lot of sense to do like the land holding company structure. And it's worth it for you for a large scale project. And you can bear all of the costs of compliance. If you're like an individual and maybe you just want to like own your own home, do something smaller scale, then I think you should like think very hard about whether the land holding company structure is appropriate for you, because there are a lot of like costs and there are a lot of compliance obligations. you still might be willing to do it, but I think you have to really just be aware of what you're getting into. Talk to like a legal professional, talk to a tax and accounting professional to really understand, does this make sense for you? So yeah, that's like what I'll say for that structure.
Thank you, Jay. I think that's having a kind of bigger topic to discuss, probably a good place for us to leave off with just a couple of remarks. I think there have been some really fascinating questions. There are a lot more on there that I'd like to get to, but unfortunately we're quickly running out of time. So if you have any questions, we'll send out the deck to all of you who joined this morning, along with the contact details for Jay and myself, and do feel free to reach out and ask us any specific questions that you've got, and I'm sure we'll both be happy to come back to you and give us give you our take on that. It's been a real pleasure, Jay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James.
There's been a lot of good takeaways from that. It's great that we can do this even at the moment and get this set up and have this conversation with our clients across the region and in Cambodia. So thank you again, much appreciated.
Thank you, everyone. If you have any questions, please let your James know. We'd be happy to answer them.
Wonderful. Thank you all very much. Greatly appreciated for joining. And as we say, we'll send the deck out and get the video up a little bit later on once we've sorted everything out. So thank you, and look forward to seeing you at the next one.